In the shadowy depths beneath the earth, a god known for his cold detachment made a decision that would fracture the divine family forever. Hades, ruler of the dead and brother to Zeus, didn't just want a companion. He wanted his own niece, Persephone, the radiant daughter of his sister Demeter. What began as forbidden desire in a meadow of wildflowers would become one of mythology's most controversial unions, a story of abduction disguised as destiny, where the line between love and possession blurred into darkness. The underworld was a realm of perpetual twilight, where the rivers Styx, Acheron, and Phlegethon carved through landscapes of ash and stone. Here, in a palace carved from obsidian and adorned with veins of precious metals pulled from the earth's core, Hades ruled with absolute authority. Unlike his brothers Zeus and Poseidon, who reveled in their domains with enthusiasm and frequent indulgence, Hades was methodical, serious, and profoundly alone. The division of the cosmos had been decided by lot after the Titanomachy, the brutal war against their father Kronos and the older generation of gods. Zeus claimed the heavens and became king of the gods. Poseidon took dominion over the seas, commanding the waves with his trident. And Hades, the eldest of the three brothers, despite being the last to be regurgitated from Kronos' stomach, received the underworld. It was not a punishment, though many perceived it as such. It was simply the draw of fate. Yet fate, as Hades knew better than most, could be a cruel architect. While his brothers entertained themselves with the affairs of mortals and the company of countless lovers, Hades remained in his shadowy kingdom, cataloging the dead, ensuring the cosmic balance between life and death remained undisturbed. He was depicted by poets and mortals as stern, pitiless, and unmoved by prayer or sacrifice. This reputation wasn't entirely undeserved. Death, after all, comes for everyone, and Hades embodied that inevitability. He held all souls equally accountable to his laws. There were no exceptions, no bribes that could sway him, no tears that could soften his judgment. His palace was filled with what he called guests, though they could never leave. The judges Minos, Rhadamanthus, and Aeacus worked tirelessly, sorting souls into their eternal destinations. The paradise of Elysium for the heroic and virtuous, the neutral asphodel meadows for the ordinary, and the punishing depths of Tartarus for the wicked. Hades supervised this system with the precision of a master craftsman, inventing punishments that were perfectly tailored to each sinner's crimes. Sisyphus eternally pushed his boulder up a hill, only to watch it roll back down. Tantalus stood in a pool of water that receded whenever he tried to drink, beneath fruit trees whose branches lifted away whenever he reached for them. These were not acts of cruelty for cruelty's sake, but rather Hades's understanding of poetic justice, his cold intelligence finding the perfect reflection of each soul's earthly transgressions. But intelligence and purpose could not fill the hollow spaces that had begun to form in Hades's existence. Millennia of isolation, surrounded by the dead and the dying, had carved away something essential from his divine nature. He rarely ascended to Mount Olympus for the gatherings of the gods. When he did, he was met with discomfort and fear. His siblings and nieces and nephews would fall silent when he entered, as if death itself had walked into the room. Even among immortals, he was an outsider, a reminder of the one fate that mortals could not escape, and that even gods preferred not to contemplate. Hades did not resent them for this, not exactly, but he felt the weight of it nonetheless. His only true companion was Cerberus, his three-headed hound who guarded the gates of the underworld with unwavering loyalty. The beast was terrifying to souls who attempted to escape, tearing apart any who tried to flee Hades's domain without permission. But to Hades, Cerberus was simply there, a constant presence in a realm where everything else was transient, where souls arrived and were sorted and remained in their assigned eternities. Hades would sometimes walk the banks of the river Styx, watching Charon ferry the newly dead across its dark waters. He would observe the judges at their work, ensuring fairness in their verdicts. He would inspect the fields of asphodel, where countless souls wandered in a state neither happy nor sad, simply existing. And in those moments, surrounded by the architecture of death he had so carefully maintained, Hades would feel the profound loneliness that came from being the only living consciousness in a kingdom of shadows. The underworld was vast and terrible and perfectly ordered. It was also unbearably empty of anything that could be called companionship, conversation, or connection. Hades was the wealthiest of all gods, for every precious metal and gem in the earth belonged to him. His robes were woven from the finest materials, embroidered with gold and silver thread, adorned with jewels that would make mortal kings weep with envy. But wealth meant nothing when there was no one to share it with, no one to understand the burden of his responsibilities, no one to see him as anything other than the god of death. It was this loneliness, this void that even immortality could not fill, that made what happened next not just possible, but perhaps inevitable. One day, Hades emerged from the underworld. It was a rare occurrence, for he had little interest in the world above. The sunlight felt harsh after the perpetual twilight of his realm, and the sounds of living things, birds singing and wind rustling through leaves, seemed almost alien to ears accustomed to the silence of the dead. But something had drawn him upward, some restlessness that even he could not fully explain. Perhaps it was the weight of eternity pressing down on him, or perhaps it was simply chance, that capricious force that even gods cannot entirely predict. He found himself in Sicily, in a meadow that burst with spring flowers. The grass was impossibly green, dotted with wild flowers of every color: purple crocuses, golden daffodils, white lilies, and red poppies. The air was warm and fragrant, filled with the buzzing of bees and the songs of larks. It was, in every way, the opposite of his kingdom. And there, moving through that riot of color and life, was Persephone. She was gathering flowers with her companions, young nymphs who laughed and chased each other through the meadow. But Hades saw only her. Persephone was the daughter of Demeter, goddess of the harvest and agriculture, and Zeus, king of the gods. She had inherited her mother's connection to the living, growing world and her father's divine beauty and power. Her hair caught the sunlight like spun gold. Her laughter carried across the meadow like music. She moved with an unconscious grace, bending to examine flowers, her hands gentle as she selected the most beautiful blooms for her basket. There was an innocence about her, a joy in the simple pleasure of a spring day that struck something deep in Hades's ancient heart. He watched from the shadows at the edge of the meadow, and for the first time in countless centuries, he felt something other than the cold detachment that had become his constant companion. It was desire, yes, but also something more complex. Looking at Persephone, surrounded by life and light, Hades felt the full weight of his own darkness. She represented everything he was not, everything his realm could never be. And perhaps that was precisely why he wanted her so desperately. In that moment, standing at the boundary between the world of the living and his kingdom of shadows, Hades made a decision that would echo through eternity. He could not simply approach her as a suitor might. He was the lord of the underworld, older than most of the Olympians, her uncle by blood. More than that, he knew that Demeter, fiercely protective of her only daughter, would never consent to such a union. Demeter kept Persephone close, sheltering her from the often sordid affairs of the other gods, preserving her innocence and joy. To ask permission through proper channels was to guarantee refusal. So Hades did what had become natural to him in his long existence. He calculated, he planned, and he acted with the cold efficiency that characterized his rule over the dead. He ascended to Mount Olympus, to the great palace where Zeus held court. His brother was lounging on his throne, surrounded by the trappings of his power, the master of the sky and king of the gods. When Hades entered, the atmosphere shifted. Even Zeus, powerful as he was, felt a moment of unease in the presence of his elder brother. Hades stated his desire plainly. He wanted Persephone, as his wife, to be queen of the underworld, to reign beside him in the realm of the dead. Zeus listened, his expression unreadable. The request put him in a difficult position. On one hand, Hades was his brother, and the union would strengthen the family bonds among the first generation of Olympians. On the other hand, Demeter would be furious, and her power over the harvest made her someone even Zeus was reluctant to antagonize. But Zeus had his own reasons for agreeing. Perhaps he saw advantage in placating his somber brother. Perhaps he believed that Hades, given his personality and responsibilities, deserved some happiness. Or perhaps, as some versions of the story suggest, Zeus simply made a decision without fully considering the consequences, a pattern that characterized many of his judgments. Whatever his reasoning, Zeus gave his consent. He agreed that Hades could take Persephone as his bride. But there was a crucial condition implicit in this agreement. Demeter must not be consulted. This was not a negotiation, it was a fait accompli. Zeus was essentially giving Hades permission to abduct his own daughter, to bypass the mother's authority entirely. It was a betrayal that would shatter the family and unleash consequences neither brother fully anticipated. With Zeus's blessing secured, Hades returned to his realm and began to prepare. He could not simply appear in the meadow and take Persephone by force in front of her companions. The act needed to be swift, isolated, and complete. He needed to separate her from her friends, to create a moment of vulnerability. For this, he would use his dominion over the earth itself. Hades caused a special flower to grow in that same Sicilian meadow, a narcissus of extraordinary beauty. Its petals shimmered with colors not found in any natural bloom, purple and silver intertwined in patterns that seemed to shift and dance in the light. It was positioned carefully, far enough from where Persephone's companions played that she would need to wander away from them to reach it. The trap was set with the patience of someone who had waited millennia and could wait a little longer. Hades knew Persephone's nature. She loved flowers, loved beauty, loved the act of gathering and arranging the blooms of spring. The narcissus would call to that part of her, would draw her away from safety, would place her exactly where he needed her to be. And so he waited, in the darkness beneath the earth, his chariot prepared, his horses ready, watching through the layers of soil and stone as Persephone and her companions returned to the meadow. He watched as she laughed and played, innocent and unaware. He watched as her eyes caught sight of the impossible flower, as curiosity and delight bloomed across her face. He watched as she told her friends she would be right back, as she walked toward the narcissus, bending down to pluck it from the earth. And in that moment, Hades struck. If you're finding this story as fascinating as we do, take a moment to leave a comment with the word mythology below. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next chapter of this incredible tale. Now, let's continue with what happened next. The earth split open beneath Persephone's feet with a sound like thunder. One moment she was standing in a sunlit meadow, her fingers closing around the stem of the most beautiful flower she had ever seen. The next, the ground was rupturing, cracks spreading outward in a violent spider web pattern, soil and stone falling away into a chasm of absolute darkness. From that darkness came Hades, rising in a chariot of black iron pulled by four immortal horses whose coats seemed to absorb light itself. Their eyes glowed like embers, their breath came out in clouds of shadow, and their hooves struck sparks of blue fire against the rocks. Hades himself was a figure of terrifying majesty in his battle armor, his face partially hidden beneath his helm of invisibility, though he had pulled it back enough that Persephone could see his features. Those eyes, ancient and cold and burning with an intensity that froze her in place. Persephone tried to scream. The sound that emerged from her throat was swallowed by the roar of the earth itself, by the cascading stones and the thunder of hooves. Her companions, just yards away, turned at the sound, but they were too late. Hades reached down with one arm and lifted Persephone into the chariot with effortless, divine strength. She struggled, beating her fists against his chest, trying to call upon her own divine powers. But she was young, untrained in the use of her abilities beyond making flowers grow. And Hades was ancient, powerful, and absolutely determined. The chariot plunged into the chasm, horses galloping down a path that appeared beneath their hooves, spiraling deeper and deeper into the earth. Behind them, the ground sealed itself shut, grass and flowers growing back over the scar in the earth as if nothing had happened. Persephone's companions ran to the spot where she had been standing moments before, but there was nothing, no crack in the earth, no sign of what had occurred. Only the narcissus remained, lying on the grass where it had fallen from Persephone's hand. The descent into the underworld felt endless. Persephone saw the layers of the earth pass by in a blur. Soil and stone, ancient roots of trees, underground rivers, caverns filled with crystals that glinted in the light cast by the horses' hooves. The air grew colder, denser, pressing in around her like a physical weight. She could feel the life draining from the atmosphere, replaced by something else, something that tasted of endings and eternity. Hades said nothing during the journey. He kept one arm around Persephone, holding her steady in the chariot, not roughly but firmly, preventing her from throwing herself out, which she absolutely would have done. His face was set, expression unreadable, focused on the path ahead. If he felt any remorse for her terror, he did not show it. Finally, after what might have been minutes or hours, time losing meaning in the descent, they emerged into the underworld proper. Persephone had heard stories of this place from the other gods, whispered tales that emphasized its horror and darkness. But nothing had prepared her for the reality of it. The underworld stretched out before her, vast and terrible and beautiful in its own alien way. The sky, if it could be called that, was a canopy of shadow that seemed to pulse with distant, cold light. The landscape was composed of black stone and gray ash, punctuated by rivers that flowed with waters darker than any found on earth. In the distance, she could see structures. The palace of Hades, towering and magnificent, built from obsidian and decorated with veins of gold and silver. And everywhere were the dead. They drifted like mist through the landscape, translucent forms that barely maintained the shapes they had worn in life. Some seemed aware of their surroundings, walking with purpose toward judgment. Others simply wandered, lost in the transition between life and death. Their collective presence created a sound like distant wind, a whisper of voices that never quite resolved into words. The chariot came to a stop at the gates of Hades' palace, where Cerberus waited. The three-headed hound was massive, each head the size of a horse, each mouth filled with teeth like daggers. All 6 eyes fixed on Persephone with an intelligence that was distinctly unnatural. But when Hades descended from the chariot, Cerberus approached with something almost like gentleness, lowering his heads to receive his master's touch. Hades spoke a few words to the beast in a language Persephone didn't recognize, something older than Greek, perhaps older than language itself. Then he turned to her, extending his hand to help her down from the chariot. Persephone recoiled from his touch, pressing herself back against the far side of the chariot. Her voice, when she found it, was shaking with fury and fear. She demanded to know what he thought he was doing, how he dared to abduct her, to bring her to this place of death. She invoked her mother's name, her father's name, threatening divine retribution and eternal consequences. Hades listened to all of this without interruption, his expression unchanging. When she finally exhausted herself, her voice breaking on threats that sounded hollow even to her own ears in this place so far from the light, he spoke. His voice was deep, measured, the voice of someone accustomed to absolute authority. He told her that he had claimed her as his wife, that she would be queen of the underworld, that this was her home now. He said it without malice, but also without negotiation, a simple statement of fact as he saw it. The presumption of it, the sheer audacity, reignited Persephone's rage. She told him she would never accept this, never accept him, that she would find a way to escape, to return to her mother, to the world of light and life. Hades regarded her for a long moment, and something flickered in his eyes, an emotion she couldn't quite identify. Then he simply nodded, as if her defiance was expected and perhaps even understood. He instructed his servants, shadowy figures that seemed to be made of the darkness itself, to prepare chambers for her. Persephone was taken to a suite of rooms within the palace that would have been luxurious by any standard. The walls were polished obsidian that reflected her image like dark mirrors. The furnishings were exquisite, a bed carved from a single piece of black marble, covered with silk sheets the color of midnight. Chests filled with robes and jewelry, each piece more valuable than most mortal kingdoms. But none of it mattered. None of it could compensate for the fact that she was a prisoner, that every exit was guarded by the dead, that Cerberus prowled the outer gates ensuring that no one, living or dead, could leave without Hades's express permission. In those first days, or what Persephone assumed were days in a place where the sun never rose and night never fell, she refused everything. She refused to eat, refused to drink, refused to speak to Hades when he came to her chambers. She spent her time staring at the walls, at the ceiling, searching desperately for any crack, any weakness she could exploit to escape. But the palace was built by an immortal architect for an immortal ruler. There were no weaknesses. Meanwhile, above, in the world of the living, Demeter was experiencing her own descent into darkness. When Persephone failed to return home that evening, Demeter went looking for her. She questioned the nymphs who had been with Persephone in the meadow. They described what they had seen: the earth opening, the chariot of shadow. Their friend's screams cut short as she was pulled into the depths. But they had not seen the abductor's face, could not tell Demeter who had stolen her daughter. For 9 days and 9 nights, Demeter searched. She transformed herself into a mortal woman and walked the earth, questioning anyone who might have witnessed something, following any lead no matter how slim. She carried torches to light her way through the darkness, and she did not eat or drink or rest. Her grief was absolute, consuming, the kind of pain that only a mother who has lost a child can understand. And as she searched, as her anguish grew, the earth began to reflect her sorrow. Demeter was the goddess of a harvest, the deity who ensured that crops grew and fields bore fruit. Her blessing was what allowed mortals to survive, to cultivate the land, to store grain for the winter. But now, in her grief, she withdrew that blessing entirely. The crops that had been growing in fields across Greece began to wither. The grain turned brown and dry. Fruit rotted on the vine. The earth itself seemed to become barren, refusing to nurture seed or root. Farmers tried everything they knew, every ritual and prayer, but nothing worked. Without Demeter's favor, the land was dead. As days turned to weeks and weeks to months, famine began to spread across the mortal world. Stores of grain ran empty. Animals starved in fields where grass no longer grew. Children cried with hunger that their parents could not satisfy. The mortals made offerings to all the gods, but the gods could do nothing. This was Demeter's domain, and she had abandoned it in her grief and fury. The other Olympians watched with growing concern. They approached Demeter, trying to reason with her, to convince her to restore the harvest before all of humanity perished. But Demeter was beyond reason. She told them she would not allow a single seed to sprout from the earth until her daughter was returned to her. If Persephone was lost, then let the world share in her suffering. Let everything green and growing die. Let the mortals understand what it meant to have something precious stolen away. The gods returned to Zeus with this message, and for the first time, Zeus began to understand the magnitude of what he had agreed to. The famine was not just affecting mortals. The gods depended on human worship, on sacrifices and offerings and prayers. If humanity died out completely, the gods themselves would fade, their power diminishing as they were forgotten. Zeus was forced to confront what he had done, the deal he had made with Hades, without consulting Demeter. But even Zeus, king of the gods, was reluctant to directly confront his brother. The underworld was Hades's sovereign territory. Zeus had no authority there, and to demand that Hades release Persephone would be to essentially start a war between the sky and the underworld. Such a conflict could tear the cosmos apart. So Zeus tried a different approach. He sent Hermes, the messenger god, to negotiate. Hermes was perfect for this task, quick-witted, charming, and one of the few gods who could travel freely between all realms, including the underworld. He descended into Hades's kingdom with Zeus's message, and he found the Lord of the Dead in an unexpected state. Hades was troubled. Not regretful, perhaps, but definitely troubled. The abduction had not gone as he had envisioned. In his calculations, he had anticipated resistance, but he had assumed that once Persephone was in the underworld, once she understood her position and the honor he was offering her, she would eventually come to accept her new role. What he had not anticipated was the depth of her defiance, or the way her misery would affect him. Persephone had maintained her hunger strike. She had refused to engage with him in any meaningful way. She spent her days in her chambers, and when Hades visited, trying to speak with her, to explain his reasoning, to perhaps begin some form of connection, she simply stared through him as if he were one of the dead souls that populated his realm. For someone who had spent eternity in isolation, who had finally taken the risk of reaching out for companionship, her complete rejection was devastating in ways Hades had not expected. He had wanted a queen, a partner, someone to share the burden of his existence. What he had was a prisoner who looked at him with a mixture of fear and hatred. Hermes delivered Zeus's message. The mortals were dying. The other gods were concerned. Demeter would not relent. If Hades wanted to avoid divine intervention and possible war, he needed to release Persephone and allow her to return to her mother. The message was clear. This situation could not continue. Hades listened to all of this in silence. Then he asked Hermes a question that revealed the complexity of his position. He asked if Persephone had eaten anything since arriving in the underworld. The question seemed odd to Hermes, but he confirmed what Hades already knew. Persephone had refused all food and drink. She had maintained her fast throughout her entire imprisonment. This was significant because of an ancient law that governed the underworld, a law so fundamental that even Hades could not break it. Anyone who consumed food or drink in the realm of the dead became bound to that realm forever. They could not leave, not fully. Their essence became tied to the underworld, marked by death in a way that could not be undone. Persephone's refusal to eat had kept her free from this binding. If she had eaten even a single bite, even a sip of water, she would have been trapped. Hades had known this from the beginning. He had offered her food, provided elaborate meals in her chambers, hoping she would eat without understanding the consequences. But she had refused, either from stubbornness or from some instinct that warned her away. Now, facing the demand to release her, Hades made a decision that would define the rest of the story. He agreed to let Persephone go, but before she left, he would speak with her one final time. He went to her chambers and found her at the window, staring out at the rivers of the dead. She looked thinner, weakened by her fast, but still beautiful, still defiant. He told her that he was releasing her, that she would be allowed to return to her mother and the world above. He said he understood that his actions had caused her suffering, and while he could not undo what he had done, he would not keep her against the will of the other gods. Persephone turned to look at him, then really look at him, perhaps for the first time since the abduction. She saw the loneliness there, the ancient weariness, the isolation of someone who had existed apart from connection for so long that he had forgotten how to achieve it except through force. What happens next in our journey is crucial. Stay with us, because the most controversial and debated part of this entire myth is about to unfold. Make sure you're subscribed so you never miss these incredible stories. Hades continued speaking. He told Persephone that before she left, he wanted her to eat something. The journey back to the surface was long, and she had weakened herself with her fast. He said it was not a command, but a request, perhaps the first thing he had requested rather than demanded since bringing her to the underworld. He gestured to a table where a meal had been prepared, and on a plate in the center was a pomegranate, cut open to reveal its jewel-like seeds. The pomegranate was sacred to the underworld, a fruit that represented both death and rebirth, its red seeds like drops of blood, its interior chambers like the divisions of the realm of the dead itself. Persephone looked at the fruit, and then at Hades, and something passed between them in that moment, something that has been debated by scholars and storytellers for millennia. What happened next depends on which version of the story you believe. In some tellings, Hades forced the seeds into Persephone's mouth, a final act of coercion to ensure she would have to return to him. In others, one of Hades' servants, perhaps acting on orders or perhaps on their own initiative, tricked Persephone into eating. But in other versions, older versions perhaps, Persephone made a choice. Standing there in her chambers in the palace of the dead, weakened by hunger and exhaustion, facing the god who had abducted her, but who was now offering her freedom, Persephone reached out and took the pomegranate. She pulled several seeds from the fruit. Some accounts say 4, others say 6. The exact number would determine how much time she would spend in each realm, but the act itself was what mattered. She placed the seeds in her mouth and ate them, the sweet tart juice breaking across her tongue, the first food she had consumed since arriving in the underworld. The binding took effect immediately. Persephone felt it, a connection forming between herself and this realm of shadows, a tether that could never be completely severed. She belonged to the underworld now, at least in part. But she also understood, in that moment, that she had gained something as well. By eating the seeds, by accepting this bond, she had transformed from a prisoner into something else. She was no longer just the girl who had been abducted. She was becoming the queen of the dead, someone with agency and power in this domain. Why did she do it? The answer to that question reveals the transformation that had been occurring beneath the surface of her defiance. During her time in the underworld, despite her resistance, Persephone had been observing. She had watched Hades at his work, seeing how he judged the dead with a fairness that was absolute, how he ensured that each soul received the afterlife they had earned. She had seen the complexity of the underworld, not just a place of punishment, but a necessary part of existence, where death was not an ending, but a transition. And perhaps, in some way she was only beginning to understand. She had seen something in Hades himself that called to a part of her she hadn't known existed. Not love, perhaps not even affection, but a recognition of shared loneliness, of the burden of power, of the isolation that came from being different from everyone around you. Persephone had been sheltered her entire existence, kept innocent and naive by her mother's fierce protection. But she was the daughter of Zeus, god of gods, and Demeter, goddess of life itself. She had power in her blood, potential that had never been tapped. In the underworld, surrounded by death, she had begun to feel that power stirring, had begun to understand that she could be more than just the maiden in the meadow picking flowers. When Hermes returned to take Persephone to the surface, he found her changed. She carried herself differently, spoke with a new authority. And when he saw the stain of pomegranate juice on her lips, he understood what had happened. The journey back to the surface was very different from the violent descent. Persephone traveled in Hades' chariot, but this time she sat willingly, watching as the layers of earth passed by in reverse. When they finally emerged into the world above, the sunlight was blinding after the perpetual twilight of the underworld. Persephone shielded her eyes, breathing in air that smelled of grass and flowers, so different from the still, cold atmosphere she had grown accustomed to. Demeter was waiting. The moment she saw her daughter, she ran forward with a cry of joy that echoed across the landscape. She embraced Persephone, tears streaming down her face, checking her daughter for injuries, for any sign of harm. And as she held Persephone, as her relief and happiness flooded through her, the earth responded. Green shoots burst from the ground that had been barren moments before. Flowers bloomed in rapid succession, carpeting the land in color. Trees that had been bare skeletons of would suddenly burst into leaf. The famine was ending, the world returning to life in response to Demeter's joy. But the reunion was bittersweet. When Demeter asked her daughter if she had eaten anything in the underworld, when Persephone admitted to consuming the pomegranate seeds, the goddess's joy turned to horror. She understood immediately what this meant, understood that her daughter had been bound by the ancient law, that she could not remain in the world above permanently. Demeter was furious. She raged at Zeus, at Hades, at the laws that governed the cosmos. She demanded that her daughter be freed completely, that the binding be broken. But even Zeus, powerful as he was, could not undo what had been done. The law of the underworld was absolute. A compromise had to be reached, and Zeus, in his role as king of the gods and arbiter of divine disputes, crafted a solution. Persephone would spend part of each year in the underworld with Hades, fulfilling her role as queen of the dead. The rest of the year, she would return to the surface to be with her mother. The exact division varied depending on the telling. Some said she spent 4 months in the underworld for the 4 seeds she ate. Others said 6 months for 6 seeds. But the pattern was the same. For the months that Persephone was in the underworld, Demeter would mourn her absence. Her grief would cause the plants to wither, the fields to lie fallow, the world to enter a period of cold and darkness. This was autumn and winter, seasons of death and dormancy. When Persephone returned to the surface, Demeter's joy would cause life to burst forth again. Flowers would bloom, crops would grow, warmth would return to the land. This was spring and summer, seasons of life and abundance. Thus, the ancient Greeks explained the cycle of the seasons through the story of a mother's love and a daughter's abduction, of a marriage that was both forced and chosen, of a young goddess who descended into darkness and emerged transformed. The arrangement was implemented, and the cosmos adjusted to this new reality. Persephone learned to live between two worlds. During her time on the surface, she spent her days with Demeter, helping with the harvest, nurturing growing things, embodying the spring that bore her name in her guise as Kore, the maiden. But as the appointed time approached for her return to the underworld, something interesting happened. Persephone would grow quiet, thoughtful, preparing herself for the transition. And when she descended back to Hades' realm, taking her throne beside him in the palace of obsidian and gold, she did so with increasing confidence and authority. In the underworld, Persephone was no longer the terrified girl who had been abducted. She was the queen of the dead, and she ruled with a compassion that balanced Hades' stern justice. Where he was cold, she brought understanding. Where he was harsh, she offered mercy when it was deserved. The souls of the dead learned to appeal to Persephone when they sought leniency, and she would listen to their cases, making judgments that were wise beyond her years. The relationship between Hades and Persephone evolved as well. What had begun as abduction transformed into something more complex. They never had the passionate romance that characterized Zeus's many affairs. Their connection was quieter, built on mutual respect and understanding. Hades treated Persephone as an equal, consulting her on matters of the underworld, valuing her opinions. He created gardens for her in the darkness, using his power to make things grow even in the realm of death. Pomegranate trees flourished there, and asphodel flowers, and other plants that could thrive without sunlight. For her part, Persephone brought life to the underworld in ways that had nothing to do with plants. She brought conversation, perspective, challenge. She questioned Hades' decisions when she thought they were unjust, and he, remarkably, would listen. She softened some of the harsher aspects of the underworld while maintaining its necessary functions. She became genuinely powerful in her own right, a goddess whose dominion over death rivaled that of her husband. Stories began to circulate of Persephone's dual nature. She was both the maiden of spring and the dread queen of the dead. She could bless crops or curse fields. She could grant mercy to souls in the underworld or condemn them to worse fates. She embodied the cycle of life and death, growth and decay, the eternal return that characterized existence itself. One of the most telling aspects of Persephone's transformation comes from the myths that followed her establishment as queen of the dead. She was not a passive figure. When the hero Orpheus descended into the underworld to retrieve his dead wife Eurydice, it was Persephone who was moved by his music and his love, who convinced Hades to give Eurydice a chance to return. When the legendary hero Heracles needed to borrow Cerberus as one of his 12 labors, it was Persephone who negotiated the terms. She had become integral to the functioning of the underworld, not just a decoration or a hostage, but an active ruler with her own power and authority. There are also darker stories. Persephone could be as stern and unforgiving as Hades when circumstances warranted. When the nymph Minna, who had been one of Hades' lovers before Persephone, dared to boast that she was more beautiful than the queen and that Hades would eventually return to her, Persephone transformed her into the mint plant, forever to be walked upon and crushed. When Adonis, the beautiful mortal beloved by Aphrodite, died, both Aphrodite and Persephone claimed him. The dispute was so intense that Zeus had to intervene, decreeing that Adonis would spend part of the year with each goddess, and part of the year alone. Persephone's claim on him was absolute when he was in the underworld. Death, after all, had its rights. These stories reveal a goddess who had grown from the innocent maiden picking flowers to a complex figure capable of jealousy, possessiveness, and the ruthless exercise of power. The underworld had changed her, marriage to Hades had changed her, but perhaps most significantly, she had changed herself, claiming agency over her own transformation. The question that has fascinated people for millennia is whether Persephone's story is ultimately one of victimization or empowerment. The answer, perhaps, is that it's both, and that's what makes it so compelling. Persephone did not choose to be abducted. The violence of that initial act cannot be erased or justified. She was taken from her home, separated from her mother, trapped in a place that terrified her. Zeus's complicity in allowing the abduction to happen was a betrayal of paternal duty. Hades' assumption that he could simply take what he wanted, regardless of her wishes, was an abuse of power. These are the facts of the story, and they are troubling. But it's also true that Persephone transformed that trauma into power. She made choices, limited though they were by her circumstances, that gave her agency. Whether eating the pomegranate seeds was a conscious decision to bind herself to the underworld and claim a throne, or whether it was coerced or tricked, by the time the cycle was established, Persephone had made the role her own. She was not just Hades' wife. She was a ruler in her own right. The Greeks who told and retold this story understood its complexity. They did not simply celebrate Hades as a romantic hero or condemn him as a villain. They acknowledged the problematic nature of the relationship's beginning, while also recognizing the power and authority that Persephone ultimately claimed. They created a goddess who embodied the transition between innocence and experience, between life and death, between powerlessness and sovereignty. In her yearly descent and return, Persephone enacted the universal human experience of loss and renewal, of trauma and transformation, of the ways in which we are changed by our experiences and the choices we make in response to them. The myth also speaks to the relationship between mothers and daughters, to the inevitable separation that comes as daughters grow into their own identities. Demeter's grief at losing Persephone is real and valid, but there's also something in the story about the necessity of that loss, about how children must sometimes go to dark places their parents cannot follow, must face challenges and transformations that separate them from the innocence their parents wish to preserve. When Persephone returns each spring, she is not the same girl who was abducted. She carries the underworld with her, the knowledge of death, the complexity of her experiences. And Demeter must accept this changed daughter, must allow her to be both the maiden of spring and the queen of the dead. The cycle continues eternally. Each year, as autumn approaches, Persephone prepares to return to the underworld. She says goodbye to her mother, to the sunlight, to the world of the living. She descends into darkness, takes her throne beside Hades, and rules over the dead with wisdom earned through suffering and transformation. And each spring, she rises again, bringing life and renewal, the eternal return of the goddess who moves between worlds. Her story has inspired countless retellings, from ancient Greek pottery showing the moment of abduction to modern novels and comics that reimagine the relationship between Hades and Persephone in various ways. Some versions emphasize the romance, softening or eliminating the problematic elements to create a love story between darkness and light. Others lean into the horror of the abduction, using it to explore themes of consent, autonomy, and survival. The myth is elastic enough to support these varied interpretations, which speaks to its fundamental power as a story. It touches on primal fears and desires, the fear of loss, the desire for power, the complicated relationship between love and possession, the transformation that comes from surviving trauma, the eternal cycle of death and rebirth that defines existence. In the end, Persephone stands at the crossroads of all these themes, a goddess who is simultaneously victim and queen, innocent and knowing, bringer of life and sovereign of death. Her story asks difficult questions about the nature of choice when options are constrained by power, about whether transformation achieved through trauma can still be considered empowerment, about the price we pay for the roles we inhabit and the identities we claim. The ancient Greeks did not provide easy answers to these questions, and perhaps that's appropriate. Persephone's myth is not a fairy tale with a clear moral. It's a story that reflects the complexity and ambiguity of real experience, where people are changed by forces beyond their control, but still find ways to claim agency within those constraints. It's a story about how the same event can be both a kidnapping and a coronation, both a loss and a gaining, both an ending and a beginning. The seasons continue their cycle. Winter comes, and we know that Persephone has descended to her throne in the underworld, reigning over the dead with the authority she has claimed. Spring returns, and we know she has ascended once more, bringing renewal and life, carrying with her the wisdom and power earned in the darkness. She is forever both the maiden picking flowers in the meadow and the dread queen sitting beside Hades on a throne of obsidian. She is Kore and Persephone, life and death, innocence and experience, victim and sovereign. She is the goddess who was stolen and the goddess who rules. And her story endures because it speaks to the fundamental truth that we are all transformed by our journeys into darkness, and that transformation, however it comes, is part of what makes us whole. This ancient story continues to provoke debate even today. Was Persephone a victim who made peace with her circumstances, or did she find genuine power in the darkness? What does this myth reveal about family betrayal, forced unions, and the resilience required to transform tragedy into sovereignty? Share your perspective in the comments below. Do you see this as a love story or a cautionary tale about divine abuse of power? Was the eating of the pomegranate seeds an act of manipulation by Hades, or was it Persephone's first real choice in claiming her destiny? How do you interpret the annual cycle? Is it Persephone being forced to return to her captor, or is it a goddess choosing to split her time between two realms where she holds power? These questions don't have simple answers, and that's what makes this myth so endlessly fascinating. Subscribe to our channel for more untold stories from mythology that challenge everything we thought we knew about the ancient gods. The next chapter in our series will reveal another shocking truth hidden in the shadows of Mount Olympus. Until then, remember that the most powerful stories are the ones that refuse to give us easy comfort, that force us to confront difficult truths about power, choice, and transformation. Thank you for joining us on this journey into the dark heart of one of mythology's most controversial tales.